A large tree stood near the entrance of the garden. The roses growing on it were white, but there were three gardeners at it, busy painting them red. Alice thought this was a very curious thing, and she went nearer to watch them. And just as she came upon them, she heard one of them say, "Look out, Five! Don't go splashing paint over me like that." "I couldn't help it," said Five in a sulky tone. Seven jogged my elbow. On which Seven looked up and said, "That's right, Five. Always lay the blame on others." "You better not talk," said Five. "I hear the Queen say only yesterday you deserved to be beheaded. For what for?" "That's none of your business, too," said Seven. "Yes, it is my business," said Five, "and tell him it was for bringing the cook tulip roots instead of onions." Seven flung down his brush and had just begun, well, all of the unjust things, when his eye chanced to fall upon Alice as she stood watching them, and he checked himself suddenly. The others looked around, so all of them bowed low. "Would you tell me, please," said Alice, a little timidly, "why are you painting those roses?" Five and Seven said nothing, but looked at Two. Two began in a low voice, "Why, the fact is, you see, miss, this was this ought to have been a red rose tree, and we put a white one in by mistake, and if the Queen was to find out, we would all have our heads cut off, you know. So, you see, miss, we are doing the best afore she comes to." At this moment Five had been anxiously looking across the garden, called out, "The Queen! The Queen!" and the three gardeners instantly threw themselves flat upon their faces. There was the sound of many footsteps. Alice looked around, eager to see the Queen. The first 10 soldiers came carrying clubs. These were all shaped like the gardeners, with their hands and feet at the corners. The next 10 coteries. After these came the royal children. There were 10 of them, and the little dears came jumping merrily along, hand in hand in couples. Alice was rather doubtful. She ought to lie down on her face like the three gardeners, but she could not even remember having heard of such a rule as processions. And besides, what would be the use of a procession, she thought, if people had all to lie down on their faces so that they could see it? So she stood where she was and waited. When the procession came opposite to Alice, they all stopped and looked at her, and the Queen said severely, "Who is this?" she said to the Knave of Hearts, who only bowed and smiled in reply. "Idiot," said the Queen, tossed her head impatiently, and turning to Alice, she went on, "What's your name, child?" "My name is Alice, so please your Majesty," said Alice very politely, but then she added to herself, "Why, they're only a pack of cards after all. I need to be afraid of them." "And who are these?" said the Queen, pointing to the three gardeners who were lying around the rose tree. For you see, were lying on their faces, and the pattern of their backs was the same as the rest of the pack. She could not tell whether they were gardeners, or soldiers, or own children. "How should I know?" said Alice. Alice, surprised at her own courage. "It's no business of mine." "I see," said the Queen, who had meanwhile been examining the roses. Off with their heads. You shall all be beheaded." "Off their heads!" shouted the Queen. "Their heads are gone." "If it please your Majesty, the shoulders," shouted reply. "That's right," shouted the Queen. "Can you play croquet?" The soldiers were silent, and looked at Alice, as the question was evidently meant for her. "Yes, come on then," said the Queen. "It is a very fine day," said a timid voice at her side. She was walking by the White Rabbit, who was peeping anxiously into her face. "Very," said Alice. "Where's the Duchess?" "Hush, hush," said the Rabbit in a low, hurried tone. He looked anxiously over her shoulder, and raised himself upon tiptoe, put his mouth close to his ear, and whispered, "She's under sentence of exertion." "What for?" "Did you say, 'What a pity'?" said the Rabbit. "No, I didn't," said Alice. "I didn't think it's a pity at all. I said, 'What for?'" "She boxed the Queen's ears." "Oh, hush," said the Rabbit. "The Queen will hear you." "Oh, hush," said the Rabbit, after Alice laughed. "The Queen will hear you." "Get to your places," shouted the Queen in a voice of thunder, and began running about in all directions, tumbling up against each other. However, they got settled down in a minute or two, and the game began. Alice began to feel very uneasy, to be sure, She had not as yet had any dispute with the queen, but she knew it might happen any minute, and then she thought, what would become of me? She was looking she was looking about the same She was looking about for some way to escape and wondering whether she could get away without being seen, when she noticed a curious appearance in the air. It puzzled her it puzzled her very much at first, but after watching it a minute or two, she made it out to be a grin. She said to herself, How are you getting on?" And the cat, as soon as there was mouth enough for it to speak with, Alice waited till the eyes appeared, and then nodded. "It's no use speaking to it," she thought, till its ears have to come, or at least one of them." In another minute the whole head appeared, and then Alice put down her flamingo and began an account of the game, feeling very glad she had someone to listen to her. The cat seemed to think there was enough of it now in sight, and no more of it had appeared. "I don't think they play it all fairly," Alice said in rather a complaining tone, "and they all squirrel so dreadfully one can't hear oneself speak, and they don't seem to have any rules in particular. At least, nobody attends to them. You have no idea how confusing it is. All these things have been alive. For instance, there's an arch I have to go through next, walking about at the other end of the ground, and I should have been croqueting the queen's hedgehog just now, only it ran away when it saw mine coming." "How do you like the queen?" said the cat in a low voice. "Not at all," said Alice. "She's so extremely—" Then she just noticed that the queen was close behind her listening, so she went on, "Likely to win. That it's hardly worth while finishing the game." The queen smiled and passed on. "Who are you talking to?" said the king, coming up to Alice and looking at the cat's head with great curiosity. "It's a friend of mine," said Alice. "Allow it to introduce itself." "I don't like the look of it at all," said the king. "However, it may kiss my hand if it likes." By the time she had caught the flamingo and brought it back to the fight was over, and both of the hedgehogs were out of sight. "But it doesn't matter much," thought Alice, "as all the acres are gone from this side of the ground." So she tucked it away under her arm, that it might not escape again, and went back to have a little more conversation with her friends. When she got back to the cat, she was surprised to find quite a large crowd collected around it. There was a dispute going on between the executioner, the king, and the queen, who were all talking at once, while all the rest were quite silent and looked very uncomfortable. The moment Alice appeared, she was appealed to all three to settle the question, and they repeated their arguments to her. Though as they all spoke at once, she found it very hard to make out exactly what they said. The executioner's argument was that cut off a head that you couldn't cut off a head unless there was a body to cut it from, that he had never had to do such a thing before, and he wasn't going to begin at his time of life. The king's argument was that anything that had a head could be beheaded, and you weren't to talk nonsense. "She's in prison," the queen said to the executioner. "Fetch her here." As the executioner went off like an arrow, the cat's head began fading away. At the moment he was gone, and by the time he had come back with the duchess, it had entirely disappeared. So the king and the executioner ran wildly up and down looking for it.